Haja, what if Africa's underdevelopment isn't a tragedy but a decision?
A decision? What do you mean by that?
Yeah, that's the unsettling threads Axelle Kabou pulls in her book. She asks, what if the refusal to develop is a choice?
Now, that is something I want to hear more about. Welcome to Threads of Africa, a space where African voices, books, and ideas come alive. Each episode, we open the pages of books, narrations, and oral traditions that carry the rhythms, struggles, and dreams of the continent. I'm Hajar.
And now I'm done.
And together we're weaving a richer understanding of Africa, one thread at a time.
I'm really excited to talk about today's book because it asks a question that is as bold as it is unsettling. Its French title is Si l'Afrique refusait le développement, literally translated, what if Africa is refusing to develop? Or, and if Africa denies development? And no, it's not a work of fiction. It's not a novel, not a fairy tale, and definitely not about Wakanda.
Okay.
quite the opposite. It's
No
this
Black
is
Panthers there.
Yeah, no Black Panthers there. This is a serious essay published in 1991 by the Cameroonian author Axelle Kabou. And in the book, Kabou dares to suggest that Africa's underdevelopment might not be the result of external forces alone, but could, in fact, be a conscious or unconscious choice.
Okay. So, I mean, making the link, this is probably what you mean with decision. And it sounds to me that she is putting the responsibility of underdevelopment in Africa on Africans themselves. But yeah, let me not jump the gun here and hear more about the book from you first.
Yeah, bear with me. We'll get into the nuances. Now, a quick note before we dive in. This episode marks a shift for Threads of Africa because we have been reviewing novels until now. But today I have chosen an essay. Or we have chosen? Well,
Yeah.
I did it.
It's a book you chose, so it's fine.
So why select to review an essay today? It's because I want to see how you, our audience, will react and to open the door to deeper or more rigorous discussions.
Mm-hmm.
That is not to say that African fiction books aren't about serious topics. They are absolutely on serious topics.
Yeah.
But essays invites a different kind of scrutiny, and I want to explore what that brings to our conversations.
Indeed.
So in this episode, I won't just tell what the book is about. I will be adding my own voice, my critiques, or perhaps I should say the nuances I would have loved to see woven into Kabou's argument.
Yeah. And I would like to add to that in our podcast, when we review books, we target to alternate between different regions of Africa, also different languages, and going forward, different genres. So between fiction and non-fiction.
Yeah. So first, let me say a few words about the author. Axelle Kabou is a Cameroonian author who writes in French. She published the book we are discussing today when she was just 36 years old. And somehow I feel the 30s are exactly the kind of age when one would dare to publish such a provocative work? Because reading it, I could sense it came from a place of deep anger towards African leaders, written by someone young, intelligent, and an avid reader. And yet deeply disappointed, perhaps even betrayed, I would say, by those in power. So Kabou studied English, economics, and communication in Paris, and she also worked in the development sector. So one could assume she knew the terrain well and understood the system she was critiquing. And as you might expect for a book with such a provocative title, it sparked controversy. Some accused her of being funded by the West to paint a black picture of African mentalities and cultures.
Yeah, the eternal conspiracy theorists.
Yeah.
So yeah, she works with the
Yeah.
Westerners too.
Yeah, but to
Yeah.
me, many of these critics seemed to not to have they seem not to have read the book closely, or if at all. They lingered on the surface without making the intellectual efforts to engage with the nuances of her arguments. And despite the boldness of her arguments, Kabou has remained a relatively underground figure, even within African intellectual circles. And her book wasn't widely received at the time, in part because of how sharply she challenges both African elites and the international aid establishment.
Yeah.
And by the way, a kick aside here, although Axelle Kabou herself is a translator and she has translated American books from English to French, this particular book we are discussing has never been translated into English.
Yeah, that's intriguing actually, since Cameroon is a bilingual country where both French and English are spoken. And yeah, obviously you said she's Cameroonian, right?
Yes, yeah, she is.
Yeah. In any case, I believe that's why we have Threads of Africa. And as you know, one of our objectives is being a bridge between the language and also to close the language gap in Africa. And for us personally, at least, to make both French and Arabic books more accessible to an English-speaking audience.
Indeed, but I find the fact that it wasn't translated quite sad, honestly, because as I was reading it, I couldn't help but think how her ideas resonate with arguments later made by Dambisa Moyo in Dead Age, a book that came out, I think, 18 years after Kabou's. Kabou's book feels like a conversation that should have crossed linguistic boundaries, but never quite did.
Yeah. Maybe, I mean, that's due to the fact that it was heavily critiqued and there was no kind of proactive effort to translate her book.
Yeah.
And anyways, you mentioned Dead 8, the book by Dambisa Moyo, and that is one of the most influential and popular recent African books about development. And that's a book that we will for sure talk about in our podcasts in one of the upcoming episodes.
Now, to help us navigate this book, I will explore it through three main themes, each of which lines up with how the book itself is structured. First, Axelle Kabou asks a simple question: why is Africa underdeveloped? And her answer is just as simple but brutal and direct. In her view, Africans simply don't want to develop. They reject or refuse development.
Okay.
Yeah. And just to clarify, the original French word Kabou uses is refuse. They refuse. I will alternate between refuse and reject because while refuse captures the sharp provocation, reject better conveys the deeper, more systemic critique she's making about African attitudes toward development.
Yeah.
Now, to me, it's clear that this is meant as a provocation, and she does go on to nuance that claim, which I will come back to because those nuances are essential. Still, as I mentioned earlier, when the book first came out, many African intellectuals were outraged. They found that statement not only shocking, but also in very poor taste. And yet, I'm wondering if it really is that simple, or is this provocative phrasing actually hiding a more uncomfortable truth?
Yeah. And I would assume the author is trying to kind of get her point through provocation. But yeah, let us hear more from you first on what the point is.
So the second part, in the second part, she digs deeper, right? Trying to identify what she sees as the signs of this rejection of development. She calls them the sources from which post-independence African consciousness draws its inspiration. And in other words, she's pointing at the ideological foundations that shaped African thinking in the post-colonial era, and she doesn't hold back there. She takes aim with remarkable intensity at African intellectuals of the time, and not just them, but also other self-proclaimed African specialists. According to Axelle Kabou, many of these thinkers avoid the real questions, recycle colonial and even slave era frameworks, and uphold a kind of ideological isolationism that keeps Africa cut off from the rest of the world.
Mm-hmm.
And finally, in the third part, the title of that section suggests that she's about to offer a way out of this impasse. Roughly translated, the title of the third part goes as follows: For the Advent of a Decomplexed Africa. But in reality, and here I'm already starting to share a bit of my critical take, she doesn't really shift the tone. She continues the attack, and this time directly calling out several African leaders of that era, and also one particular organization. I won't name the organization just yet, but I invite you to stay with me until the end because we'll dive into that part in more depth later on. So, those are the three key themes we will be exploring today. Let's dive in. So, the first theme, right? Why is Africa underdeveloped according to Axelle Kabou? Now, before we go any further, I want to make an important clarification. The phrase refusal of development, or in French, refus du développement, is not something Axelle Kabou invented. She actually borrows it from Edem Kodjo, a Togolese intellectual who once served as president of the Organization of the African Unity, what later became the Africa Union, and was also a former government minister in Togo. He uses the term in his book Et demain l'Afrique, in English, and tomorrow, Africa. Kabou is very transparent about this. She references the book right on the first page of her own. So it is clear she's building on an existing intellectual tradition, even if she later takes the concept in a much more personal and provocative direction. Now, just a quick heads up. The line between the first and second parts of her book is sometimes a bit blurry. So some themes might overlap as I present them. But let's get straight to the heart of her argument in this first section. Kabou puts forward a strong, even shocking idea. Africa maintains the myth that it wants development, when in reality, that desire is largely imagined. And to back this up, she offers several examples. One of her main points is that even in the 1990s, many Africans still believed that development was quote unquote a white man's thing. And that's exactly what she's denouncing. The idea that progress is something external, something that comes from outside the continent, and that moving toward it means submitting to foreign ways. One important nuance that Kabou adds is that Africans are no strangers to embracing things that come from elsewhere. She points out that people across the continent have long adopted ideas, technologies, and goods that are made in ailleurs. Now, that's English and French, meaning made somewhere else.
Yeah. And indeed, I think none of the older African civilizations would have made it to what they are. I'm thinking of the Egyptians, for example, or some of the kingdoms of Western Africa. Carthage in Northern Africa wouldn't have made those civilizations without interaction with the outside world, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. And probably most of the people know the story of Mansa Musa, the richest man
who traveled to Mecca.
to Mecca. Yeah. And then that shows you how someone in kind of very thousands of years ago has traveled from Western Africa to the
hundreds
Middle
of
East.
years, not thousands.
Okay.
I think.
Yeah. But still, I mean, travel across the African continent, in the continent and outside is not something new.
Yeah. And here you can really see the nuance of Axelle Kabou's thinking. She actually circles back and critiques her own earlier argument, the idea that development is rejected simply because it's seen as something foreign. She calls that reasoning a facade, a surface level excuse that masks deeper issues. The real challenge, she argues, lies in reframing development as an idea that also belongs to Africa, not as something imposed from the outside, but something that can emerge from within. And for that to happen, African intellectuals and development experts have a responsibility. They must help shift the narrative so that accepting development is no longer seen as a sign of weakness or cultural inferiority, but rather a legitimate self directed choice. Now, what I'm about to tell you now is my own interpretation. She doesn't state it directly in the book, but I think she's implying that Africa needs to come to terms with the idea that some things originating from the West might actually be beneficial, and that rejecting them entirely just because they come from outside could be doing more harm than good.
So I think if I am to rephrase that, she is pleading for more openness towards the outside. I mean, be it the West or other nations outside of Africa.
Yeah, although there is, it's more nuanced than that because she goes even further. For Kabou, refusing to critically examine African history, including the role that some African kings played in the transatlantic slave trade or in imperialism, is also a sign of this so-called refusal of development. She argues that as long as we avoid this kind of self-examination, Africa will remain stuck.
Yeah. So not only openness, but also a critical historical view. Exactly. And self-reflection.
Exactly. Yeah. And here's another one of my interpretations. If we did engage in that introspection, if we revisited history with honesty and clarity, it could open the door to genuine conversations about what still fuels divisions and fragmentation within the continent today.
Yeah.
She also gives more recent examples. Well, recent for the time she was writing the book.
It's the early 90s, right?
Yeah, 1991. One example she highlights is that of Félix Houphouët-Boigny, the former president of Côte d'Ivoire or Ivory Coast. So the example goes like this. At a time when his people were struggling with major economic hardship, he made the decision to build the largest basilica in the world, a massive state-funded project, even though that money could have gone toward meeting the basic needs of Ivorians. So for Kabou, this example reveals two things. First, a deep disconnect between political priorities and people's real needs. And second, it highlights how African leaders themselves can actively contribute to their country's underdevelopment.
Yeah.
She also talks about what she calls African particularism. That is a strong attachment to so-called traditional African values, which some refuse to question even when those values stand in the way of progress. She describes it as a near morbid attachment to communal or ethnic identities, an attachment that prevents the emergence of any true Pan-Africanist vision. One example she gives is Kwame Nkrumah, who strongly advocated for a united Africa.
Yeah, and Kwame Nkrumah, remind me, was he the first president of Ghana?
Yeah, I believe so.
Okay.
So he was a strong advocate for a united Africa, something akin to the United States, right? But according to Kabou, figures like Nkrumah are too often dismissed as culturally alienated or accused of trying to civilize Africa using imported ideas.
And the imported idea here being a Pan-African or Pan-Africanist vision, right? Kind of more cooperation between African countries.
Yeah, I mean, unity, like a true United States of Africa.
Okay.
So in short, one could say that Kabou denounces here what is or what she calls a cult of self, an unquestioning glorification of African values, without any self-criticism or critical distance. And for her, it is precisely this refusal to question ourselves that prevents the continent from moving forward.
Yeah. So if I am to summarize the ideas here, Kabou is basically arguing that the African identity must be a dynamic identity that evolves with requirements of current times and of progress.
Yes.
I mean, if I get it right. And also not to be clinging to the past and to folklore. And that's kind of the sense that I get from her ideas. And I can totally understand the argument. History has shown us that no nation has achieved grandeur by closing up on itself. These days, this idea is even more relevant than ever. Not only for African countries or in the African context, where we're noticing, unfortunately, more and more nations are closing up on themselves.
Yeah, and I would say there is definitely more to unpack here, and I could go on, but let's move into the second section of the book, which also corresponds to the second theme I mentioned earlier, where Kabou now turns her attention to what she sees as the signs of this refusal or rejection of development. So the second theme is about the signs of this refusal. In this second section, we really begin to see Axelle Kabou, the reader, the intellectual, coming through. She starts this section strong, quoting a number of African thinkers who argue that science is universal and that the fear of embracing scientific knowledge out of concern for cultural alienation is simply unfounded. Later on, Kabou contrast this view with the dominant voices among African development theorists at the time. The very people she believes are perpetuating colonial frameworks, whether they realize it or not. Frameworks that suggests, for example, that embracing modernity or science is somehow a betrayal of African identity, as if progress and authenticity were mutually exclusive. These are the voices she described in the title of this section as the sources from which post independence African consciousness draws its inspiration.
Yeah.
But I won't go too deep into those here. Instead, I want to focus on the counter arguments Kabou puts forward, the alternative vision she proposes, even if it's just implicitly in the book. To support her argument, she draws on the works of Cheikh Anta Diop and Joseph Kizerbo. Cheikh Anta Diop, a famous Senegalese historian, and Joseph Kizerbo, I think he's from Burkina Faso, historian as well.
Yeah.
So these two showed that Africa hasn't always lagged behind the West in terms of science or technology. And it's quite the opposite, they argue. At different points in history, Africans made significant contributions to human knowledge. So, from her perspective, the idea that adopting modern science somehow erases African identity is a myth, a constructed myth that she says is designed by Africans themselves to keep Africans locked in a mindset that resists change.
Yeah. Here I want to go back to something that you mentioned earlier. Basically the colonial frameworks, and I remember when we were discussing the episode before we recorded, kind of you mentioned this specific concept, and I struggled to find a concrete example. As for me, colonialism is mainly about looting resources from the country that you colonize, basically, and not really about preserving any kind of identity or culture in that sense. But bear with me, like I thought about an example which is a bit long, so bear with me for a second. So actually, this example is a recent concept that that I've read about kind of recently, which is called green colonialism. So basically, green colonialism refers to all of the efforts by Western nations to preserve African forests as they are under the banner of preservation, basically. So think about national parks and the likes where, yeah, tourists do their safaris. So that might sound like a noble cause in the beginning, but what happens in reality is that Western organizations behind these efforts, who obviously have the financial strength, do lobby in all kinds of ways to prevent actual development projects around these spaces. That includes developing decent cities and urban spaces for people to live and work in. Doesn't have to be cities, even villages. Sometimes entire villages are wiped out just to kind of make the space for the animals in the forest. The final objective of the Western conservation organizations in this case is to keep these forests, fauna and flora intact for the Western tourists to come spend their vacation or perform their hobbies, such as hunting. And in the process, they do prevent actual development for the indigenous population, if that is required. So in summary, to close this bracket, it is indeed possible to analyze current issues by revisiting colonial legacies or frameworks, as you mentioned.
Well, I hear you, and you've got a point here, but I will surprise you when I say that Axelle Kabou is definitely against looking at colonial or taking colonial lenses to analyze current issues. She even goes further, and this is where it gets especially controversial. She argues that debating whether colonization was good or bad is largely a distraction. She points to the broader arc of human history where no two civilizations ever met peacefully. According to her, those encounters are always through war, conquest, and power struggles. So, in that view, colonization wasn't an exception, it was the rule. So green colonization is not an exception. She would say it's also the rule. She would argue. So she would be like, yes, green colonization. Then what? What are you doing about it?
Yeah, you need to defend yourself.
Yeah. So that's her kind of take, I would say. And of course, the victorious group, when there are encounters between two civilizations, the victorious group always uses the defeated to build its own strength technologically, economically, scientifically. So, in fact, she argues that the idea that Africa was some kind of peaceful utopia before colonization is just another myth.
Yeah. So no Wakanda before colonization either.
Yeah. So Africa was not harmonious, she says, nor was it politically unified or free of internal conflicts.
Yeah. I think bottom line here, she is criticizing those who dwell on colonialism as the original sin or as a reason for all woes of Africa, basically. She's also saying that historically, whenever two civilizations met, there was conflict by definition or by nature.
Yeah.
Which basically, I guess, is based on the philosophy of realism in international relations theory. And in that case, in its encounter with Europe, Africa lost the struggle, did not defend itself as it should, and that's why it got colonized, which I guess is bad, but we just need to accept it and move on and maybe build our strengths for that not to happen again.
Yeah. So now, as you can imagine, these are the kind of statements that don't sit well with everyone.
Yeah.
And not back when the book was first published, and honestly, not even today. But here's one of my main critiques of Kabou's approach. She doesn't always make clear what should be done.
Yeah, what the solution is.
Yeah, she lays out the critique sometimes brilliantly, but often leaves the reader to connect the dots themselves. And that, in my opinion, may be one of the reasons why her work wasn't well received. She doesn't hand over a plan, she offers provocation and expects the reader to draw conclusions. Now, again, and I will say clearly, this is my own interpretation. I think what she's trying to say here is this. Africans, at that moment in time, and even today, are simply not doing enough in terms of scientific research or technological innovation. And
which is fair, I think.
Yeah, it's fair to say, right? And since it hasn't always been that way, with the argument of Joseph Kizerbo and Sheikh Anta Diop, they showed that it hasn't always been that way. So since it hasn't always been that way, we need to reinvest in science seriously this time.
Yeah.
Collectively and strategically.
Yeah. And I like the word reinvest.
Yeah.
So it's about also linking with an older tradition here.
Exactly. So almost like a student who used to excel in math, but somewhere along the line lost momentum. The solution isn't to mourn the past, it's to study harder, regain confidence, and if necessary, cheat off the good students, meaning learn from others who are doing it well without shame or hesitation.
Yeah, and the good students here are the West.
Exactly.
In this image.
Yeah. Because according to Kabou, progress doesn't always mean imitation. It can also mean reactivation. And that, I think, is what she's trying to spark in this section.
Yeah. So I think in summary, Kabou is encouraging African nations to, again, reinvest in technological progress, inter alia through learning on their own, and also from developed nations. As we said, now I think the next logical question will be, how will this happen? And that refers to two key mechanisms, in my opinion. First, how to ensure that the knowledge transfer happens between these developed nations and Africa. And second, how to finance this investment or this reinvestment in science and technology. You also mentioned initially that Kabou used to work in the development aid sector. I'm wondering if she's a proponent of the development aid sector being a driver of this technological progress.
Yeah, great question. Now, remember, Kabou, as you said, work in the development sector. So that's something she clearly understands from the inside, right? And in this part of the book, she brings a particularly sharp critique of the development aid system, one that anticipates arguments we would only see widely discussed nearly 2 decades later in Dead Aid by Dambisa Moyo. But to be clear, she's not contradicting herself here. In fact, she brings this up to nuance her earlier points about Africa embracing the path of development, even if it means learning from the West. Because for Kabou, embracing development doesn't mean embracing aid or development aid. Her argument is clear. Africa doesn't need development aid to re enter the path of scientific or technological innovation. In fact, she said aid might actually be part of the problem.
Okay, so clearly, I mean, based on that, those critics who accused her of being funded by the West or of pushing a Western agenda probably didn't treat her work very carefully.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. Because, I mean, what Kabou is actually saying is exactly the opposite, right? Africa doesn't need to be saved by the West. It needs to reclaim its own agency, including in science, technology, and development, on its own terms, actually, without dependency, but with, I would say, an arm's length collaboration and relationship with the West. So the West can be a partner, a collaborator, but not someone who will come and help Africa, basically.
Yeah. And here, I recall she gave a striking example, one that might sound small but carries huge symbolic weight. It's about secondhand clothing, and you might know something about this.
Yeah.
Kabou
We call
points.
it fripe
Voilà.
in French-speaking countries.
Yeah. So she points out that for over 100 years, Africa has been flooded with secondhand clothes from the West. And while on the surface, this might seem like a charitable or practical gesture, the long-term consequence has been devastating to local textile innovation. She argues that Africans who once had exceptional tailoring skills capable of producing true masterpieces never felt the need to modernize or evolve those techniques because the market was already saturated with cheap foreign clothing.
Yeah.
So in essence, aid replaced initiative and ended up hampering innovation.
Yeah. By the way, this example, again, kind of linking up to Dead Aid of Dambisa Moyo, she mentions a very similar example to this one, but it was specific to mosquito nets. This is based on a very known case.
Yeah, but we'll come back to Dead Aids.
Yeah. Yeah, I think, again, another sneak peek into Dead Aid.
Yeah, so for Kabou, this is emblematic of a larger pattern where well-intentioned aid ends up undermining local capacity, discouraging innovation, and locking Africans into passive roles rather than empowering them to create or to adapt and lead. So the third theme is what I call the promise of a decomplexed Africa deferred.
Deferred to when?
No, I chose this title because the third part of the book is titled For the Advent of a Decomplexed Africa. And naturally, you would expect that this is where Kabou would shift gears, that she would start laying out a vision, proposing concrete solutions, maybe even charting a path forward. But I was surprised you. That's not really what happens.
Yeah.
Once
I guess
again,
she's more skilled in critique rather than suggestion or solutions. But I think
Yeah.
it's fine, right? I mean, it's true that we can criticize her for that. But some people are just better at finding where the problems are, and it's somebody else's
maybe.
role to think about the solution.
Yeah, because she maintains the same critical tone in the third part.
Yeah.
Now, I could try to read between the lines and speculate about what she might see as the solution, but the truth is, she doesn't really say it clearly. You might remember I mentioned earlier that this is the chapter where she attacks a particular organization. Well, that organization is the African Union. So before launching into a scathing critique of the AU and its founding figures, Kabou opens the chapter with a historical comparison. She compares Africa to Japan, noting that both encountered Western civilization in the 16th century, and both were at the time torn apart by internal wars. But in her view, the outcomes diverged dramatically. In Japan, the encounter with the West helped consolidate a strong sense of national identity. And in Africa, it only deepened internal divisions and intensified fratricidal conflict. So once again, we find her turning to many of the same arguments she made earlier in the book, particularly in the first section. And by this point, the critique starts to feel a bit repetitive. And the sharpness is still here, but the structure begins to loop. And by now, you have probably noticed that Axelle Kabou doesn't hold back. She uses sharp, unapologetic language to drive her point home. And nowhere is that more evident than in her critique of the African Union. It was still the OAU, the Organization of African Unity then.
Yeah.
But honestly, I think the core of her critique remains just as relevant today.
And you know when the OAU was rebranded to African Union?
2000, the year 2000. Yeah.
Okay. Was there a specific reason, or is it just the name was changed?
Oof. I think we need to look into it.
Yeah.
So she begins this section by pointing to the rising number of African youth, particularly school dropouts, whom she refers to as neglected students, the discarded of the school system, or even more provocatively, the waste.
Oh.
Imagine that. The waste produced by the education system. These are young people who she says are now asking hard questions of the leaders who failed to give them a future.
Yeah. But
And-
it's a bit harsh to call the young people waste. It's not their fault. I mean, according to her argument.
in French,
Yeah.
les déchets du système éducatif.
It's even worse, I think.
Yeah, the French word is
Yeah.
terribly harsh.
Yeah.
Yeah, where was I? So
Yeah, so you said she questions the leaders who fail to these students, basically.
yeah, and then comes her main argument that the Organization of the African Unity, or AU back then, wasn't living up to its name. Its claim to stand for African unity, but according to Kabou, it was unity in name only.
Yeah.
She argues that the failure began with the founding fathers themselves. In fact, she refers to the founding fathers of the AU as the fathers of Africa's underdevelopment.
Yeah, it's quite harsh. Her critique. Yeah, so she doesn't give leeway to anyone.
Yeah. So rather than reversing Balkanization of Africa, which was a direct legacy of colonialism, so she argues that they had the opportunity to do so in 1963 during the creation of the OAU, but they didn't do that. They didn't erase colonial borders to choose continental unity over narrow interests, but instead, Kabou says they each clung to the microstates, prioritizing national power and post-colonial relationships with former colonizers rather than true African solidarity. So in her eyes, the so-called unity was compromised from the very beginning.
Yeah.
And in that sense, Kabou draws a historical parallel. She argues that these post-independence leaders repeated the same betrayal committed centuries earlier when some African kings during the 16th century traded their own people to Western powers in exchange for cheap goods. And in both cases, she suggests that African leaders chose short-term personal or political gain over collective liberation. The names and contexts have changed, but the logic, she said, remain tragically familiar.
Yeah, I mean, to be honest, that's debatable. Comparing participating in slave trade to, I don't know, kind of protecting the microstates as she describes them. It's debatable to compare that one to one.
She's only making a parallel. She's not saying that it's. She's just making the argument that the leaders once again are betraying people.
Yeah, or not thinking long term, maybe.
Yeah. So I'll stop here. But in my ongoing quest to read between the lines, I think what Kabou is really saying in this section is, if Africa truly wants to develop, then the African Union must evolve into something more cohesive, something more closer to the United States of Africa.
Yeah. Actually, I understand that it was much easier at the time of the founding of the African Union in 1963 to talk about a truly unified continent. But now it's almost unimaginable, especially with much more cemented national identities in each African country. Nevertheless, we shouldn't rather, and undermine some serious integration efforts on the continent. And I'm thinking about ECOWAS, for example.
Yeah.
So the West African nations, where you have open borders and trade, unified currency, and a union which is even older than the European Union, actually, if you think about it.
Yeah, but ECOWAS is no longer a very good example.
That's integrated, right? Yeah. I mean, as we said earlier, kind of, we are rather going the way of disintegration and closure of nations.
Yeah.
But that's another issue, I think.
And I think Kabou's point is really that this evolution must begin with serious investment in human capital. If you want to close this podcast, I will leave you with one of her more biting, sarcastic reflections. A comment she makes after quoting the proposals that were made during the founding of the OAU in 1963. So at the time, African leaders declared, quote unquote, there will be an African office for coffee, one for cocoa, one for bananas, one for citrus, one for pineapples, and one for palm oil.
This sounds like the ingredients of a smoothie.
And Kabou's response to that was, quote unquote, clearly, the founders of the OAU were taken quite seriously. The Africa of the 1990s has held on to its taste for forest-based economies.
Mhm.
Its scientific capital remains more or less what it was in the 15th century. The Africa of the 21st century will either become rational or it will cease to exist.
This is indeed a strong statement.
Yeah.
Yeah, this is a mic drop.
Yeah, a brutal closing line, one that still resonates uncomfortably today, I would say.
Indeed, that's correct. Yeah. I mean, I really love that. Despite the stinging, sarcastic tones, Kabou seems to be pleading for rationality, in which I like. So basically, she says Africa will have to be rational or cease to exist. It's a strong statement, but it's a powerful and an effective one. And basically, what she's trying to say that she wants a development driven by technological and industrial progress, and not natural resources or raw agricultural produce as the ingredients that you mentioned. And so, we close our journey through Et si l'Afrique refusait le développement? What if Africa is refusing to develop? A bold manifesto denouncing Africa's regressive forces and pushing African societies and elites to take charge of their own development. If this story sparked something in you, pass it on, just like oral tradition. You've been listening to Threads of Africa with Ramdan and Hajar. A bientôt, and stay curious.